If you drive through the shimmering heat of the Arizona desert toward the rising skyline of Phoenix, you will see a structure that looks like a monument to the future. It is a $5.4 billion marvel of glass, steel, and unbridled ambition. It stands as the tallest, most expensive piece of real estate in the entire Southwest, designed to be the crown jewel of a city that is growing faster than almost any other in America. But beneath the luxury penthouses, the high-tech earthquake dampeners, and the marble-clad lobbies lies a secret that was buried under layers of bureaucracy and hubris. This tower, a billionaire's dream and an engineer's nightmare, was built directly on top of a geological fracture that hasn't moved in 1,000 years, but is under more pressure than anyone wants to admit. The terrifying part is not just that the fault line exists. The terrifying part is that the lead engineers, the geological surveyors, and the city planners all knew it was there before the first bag of concrete was ever poured. They saw the data, they read the warnings, and they watched as the red flags were ignored in favor of a massive payday. This is the story of the Phoenix Apex Tower, a $5.4 billion gamble where the house always wins, but the foundation might just lose everything. To understand how a project of this scale gets greenlit on such shaky ground, you have to understand the Phoenix Gold Rush. Over the last decade, Phoenix has transformed from a sleepy desert retirement destination into a massive tech and finance hub. Land prices have skyrocketed. And in the world of high-stakes real estate, verticality is the only way to prove you have truly arrived. The Apex Tower was supposed to be the ultimate proof. The developers wanted something that would rival the skyscrapers of Dubai or Shanghai. They wanted a glass needle that pierced the desert sky. But Phoenix has a geological history that is far more complex than the flat, sandy basin suggests. While it isn't San Francisco or Tokyo, the region is crisscrossed with ancient fault lines that are part of the Basin and Range Tectonic Province. Most of these are considered dormant, but dormant is a very dangerous word in the world of structural engineering. It doesn't mean incapable of movement. It just means we haven't seen it move lately. The trouble began in the early planning stages, around 3 years before the ground was even broken. A junior geological surveyor was tasked with doing a routine deep-bore soil sample of the site. What he found wasn't just soft sand or caliche rock. He found a shearing zone. This is a telltale sign that two massive plates of the Earth's crust had, at some point, ground against each other with incredible force. He filed a report stating that the northern quadrant of the proposed tower sat directly on a secondary fault line. In any other scenario, this would have moved the project 2 blocks over. But in Phoenix, this specific plot of land was the only one zoned for a building of this height. Moving the project meant losing the view, losing the prestige, and losing the $5 billion investment. So, the report was reviewed. Then it was contextualized. And finally, it was buried under a pile of optimistic paperwork. You might be wondering, how does an engineer sleep at night knowing they are designing a $5 billion structure on a crack in the planet? The answer lies in something called over-engineering. The lead structural team, once they realized the project wasn't going to be moved, decided they would simply outsmart the Earth itself. They designed a foundation system that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. We are talking about friction piles driven hundreds of feet into the bedrock and a massive floating raft of concrete that is meant to act as a shock absorber. They claimed that even if the fault line shifted several inches, the building would stay upright, tilting like a giant lead weight but never losing its structural integrity. It is an impressive theory on paper, but nature has a way of laughing at human theories, especially when billions of dollars are on the line and shortcuts start being taken during construction. As the project moved into the build phase, the costs began to spiral. This is a common theme in failing mega projects. When you are fighting against the environment, every foot of progress costs 3 times what it should. The specialized concrete required to withstand the heat of the Arizona sun while also remaining flexible enough to handle tectonic stress was becoming a logistical nightmare. Supply chains failed. Expert consultants walked away from the project, citing unreconcilable differences with the developers. In reality, these experts were seeing the pressure to cut corners. If you are already $2 billion over budget and you are building on a fault line, the temptation to use a slightly cheaper grade of steel or a less complex damping system becomes almost irresistible to the beam counters in the back office. The public, of course, was told nothing of this. The marketing for the Apex Tower focused on the unparalleled stability and state-of-the-art safety features. They even held a press conference where they demonstrated a miniature model of the tower surviving a simulated earthquake. But a model on a vibrating table is not the same thing as a million-ton tower sitting on a shifting crust. As the building climbed higher and higher, neighbors began to notice something strange. Small cracks began appearing in the sidewalks 3 blocks away. Windows in nearby low-rise buildings began to shatter for no apparent reason. The sheer weight of the apex tower was putting so much pressure on the local geology that the dormant fault line began to groan under the strain. The Earth was literally being squeezed by the $5 billion weight of human ego. Let's talk about the money, because in megaprojects of this size, the money carries its own gravity. $5.4 billion is a number so large it's hard to wrap your head around. To put that in perspective, you could build 5 world-class stadiums for that price. You could renovate the entire infrastructure of a medium-sized city. When that much capital is tied up in a single glass tower, the project becomes too big to fail. This is a phrase we heard a lot during the financial crisis, but it applies perfectly to engineering disasters too. If the city of Phoenix had stepped in and halted construction due to the fault line, the resulting legal battles and financial ripples would have been catastrophic for the local economy. So, the regulators did what they often do in these situations. They looked the other way. They accepted updated reports that downplayed the risks. They granted variances and permits based on promises of future safety audits that were never intended to be rigorous. The architectural community was also split. To some, the Apex Tower was a miracle of modern design, featuring a double-skin glass facade that could regulate its own temperature, and a rooftop garden that utilized recycled condensation from the air conditioning system. It was billed as the greenest skyscraper in the world. But the veteran architects, the ones who had seen projects like the Millennium Tower in San Francisco tilt and sink, were sounding the alarm. They pointed out that the green features were just a distraction from the fundamental brown problem: the soil. You can have all the solar panels and gray water recycling in the world, but if your building is sitting on a pivot point, you aren't building a landmark. You are building a liability. The most shocking revelation came during a leak from a whistleblower inside the construction firm. They released internal emails showing that during the middle of the project, a subsidence event had actually occurred. For those who aren't engineering nerds, subsidence is when the ground sinks. In this case, the northern side of the tower, the side sitting on the fault, had sunk 4 inches more than the southern side. This happened over a single weekend. The response from the developers wasn't to pause and investigate, it was to use compensatory leveling. This is a fancy way of saying they just built the next floor slightly lopsided to make the building look straight again. It is the architectural equivalent of putting a piece of cardboard under a wobbly table leg, except the table is 1,000 feet tall and holds thousands of people. As we look at the history of failing megaprojects, there is always a moment where the momentum becomes unstoppable. For the Apex Tower, that moment was when the first few hundred luxury units were sold as pre-construction investments. These buyers weren't just individuals. They were massive investment funds and international speculators. Now, the developers weren't just answerable to the city. They were answerable to the global financial market. If they admitted the fault line was a problem, the property values would vanish instantly. The project had to be completed perfectly, or at least look perfect, so the original investors could exit before the truth came out. This exit strategy is the dark underbelly of the skyscraper business. Often, the people who build these risky projects are long gone by the time the first major crack appears. But why Phoenix? Why build something so risky in a place known for its stability? The answer is the halo effect. Phoenix wanted a Burj Khalifa. They wanted a Shard. They wanted a symbol that would attract tech giants and high-net-worth individuals from the coast. The Apex Tower was supposed to provide a halo of prestige over the entire downtown area, and for a while it worked. Tech firms moved into the lower third of the building, and the penthouse sold for a record-breaking $75 million. From the outside, it looked like a triumph. But inside the service corridors and the basements, the story was different. Maintenance crews began reporting acoustic anomalies, high-pitched pings and groans that echoed through the steel frame at night. These were the sounds of a building trying to hold itself together while the ground beneath it slightly shifted and settled. When you look at other engineering failures, like the Tay Bridge or the original Tacoma Narrows, there is usually a primary cause that seems obvious in hindsight. But with the Apex Tower, the cause is a cumulative layer of normalized deviance. This is a term used by NASA to describe how people become so used to a risk that they stop seeing it as a risk. To the people working on the site, the fault line became just another project constraint to be managed, like a delay in drywall delivery or a broken crane. They became desolated to the danger. They convinced themselves that because it hadn't failed yet, it wouldn't fail tomorrow. But geology doesn't work on human timelines. A fault line that hasn't moved in 1,000 years can move tomorrow. And the added weight of $5.4 billion is a very good reason for it to do so. The engineering community has a name for this kind of project: the Vanity Vault. It is a structure designed not to serve a purpose, but to store the vanity of its creators. The Apex Tower has more office space than the city currently needs and more luxury condos than the market can absorb. It was built for the sake of being built. And that is perhaps the biggest tragedy of all. If this building had been a necessary piece of infrastructure, a bridge, a hospital, a dam, perhaps the risk could be justified. But to risk the safety of a city skyline for the sake of a high-end real estate play is a failure of ethics as much as a failure of engineering. Today, the tower still stands. To the casual observer, it is a success, but the data tells a different story. Laser sensors placed around the foundation show that the building is continuing to settle at an uneven rate. The tilt is currently within the allowable limits set by the very people who built it, but those limits are being pushed every year. The fault line remains a silent participant in the tower's future. The city has recently passed new geological requirements for buildings over 50 stories, but these laws aren't retroactive. The Apex Tower is a legacy structure, exempt from the very rules it helped inspire. It sits there, a shimmering glass needle in the desert heat, waiting for a tectonic shift that may not come for another 100 years, or could come this afternoon. For those interested in megaprojects, the Apex Tower is a case study in how the sunk cost fallacy can drive a project to the brink of disaster. When you have already spent $2 billion, you are willing to ignore a fault line. When you have spent $4 billion, you are willing to bury a report. When you have spent $5.4 billion, you are willing to tell the world that everything is fine, while the building groans beneath your feet. It is a cautionary tale for the future of our cities. As we build higher and more impressively, we must remember that the most beautiful glass facade is worthless if the ground it stands on is a fracture in the earth. The developers who pushed this through didn't just build a tower, they built a legacy of uncertainty. Every time there is a tremor in the region, the residents of Phoenix look toward that glass needle and wonder if today is the day the theories of those lead engineers are finally put to the test. They wonder if the friction piles will hold, if the floating raft will stay level, or if the compensatory leveling will show its true face. It is a state of perpetual anxiety that is invisible to the tourists taking photos of the skyline, but very real to the people who work in the offices and sleep in the penthouses. As we wrap up the story of the Apex Tower, we have to look at what it says about our modern era of construction. We are in an age where we have the technology to build almost anything, but we don't always have the wisdom to know where we should build it. We have replaced geological respect with engineering arrogance. We believe that with enough money and enough concrete, we can override the fundamental realities of our planet. But as this $5.4 billion Phoenix Tower shows, the Earth always has the final word. The fault line is still there, the pressure is still there, and the world is watching to see what happens next. This is a story that should remind us all to look beneath the surface. Don't just look at the glass and the lights. Look at the foundation. Ask the questions that the developers didn't want to answer. Be the voice that says maybe we shouldn't when everyone else is saying we must. Because at the end of the day, a building is more than just a piece of real estate or a symbol of city pride. It is a promise of safety to the people inside it. And if that promise is built on a fault line, it is a promise that is already broken. The Phoenix Apex Tower remains a monument to that broken promise, standing tall for now, but always at the mercy of the ground it so desperately tried to ignore. It is the most expensive gamble in the history of the desert, and only time will tell who pays the ultimate price when the Earth finally decides to move. In the world of failing megaprojects, the Apex Tower represents the grand illusion. It is the illusion that we can separate financial success from physical reality. The project made its developers rich, it made the city look modern, and it gave the investors their exit. On a balance sheet, it is a win, but in the physical world, it is a ticking clock. It is a reminder that no amount of money can buy a truly solid foundation where nature has intended a crack. If you ever find yourself in Phoenix, Look at that tower. Marvel at its height. Admire its design. But as you do, remember the surveyor with his bore sample, the whistleblower with his emails, and the acoustic anomalies echoing through the steel. Remember that sometimes, the most impressive thing about a building isn't how high it reaches, but how long it can stay standing on a foundation of lies. The Apex Tower is a $5.4 billion ghost story, waiting for its ending. And in the quiet desert nights, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the ground beginning to whisper back. Keep your eyes on the skyline, and keep your questions louder than the marketing. This is the reality of the modern mega project, where the line between a miracle and a mistake is often as thin as a fracture in the bedrock.